we're going to go through a production example now using hair, and hopefully we'll pass on some tips and techniques on how to work with hair, how to optimize it for your own productions. So the first thing we're going to look at actually is how to create a hairstyle for a character. And now the approach, to doing fur for a full creature versus local effects like a mustache or hair is quite different. So what we're going to show right now is just a workflow for hairstyling, and we'll go on to full creature stuff later on. So the first thing I'd like to mention is the fact that when you're setting up your character for hair, it's a smart idea to actually create clusters on the objects. Let's just go to our selection filter. Create clusters where you actually want to apply the hair. And in this way, you can quickly access the exact polygons that are creating the hair effect later on, or if you need to reapply the hair, you know exactly which polys the hair has been applied to. One thing to keep in mind too when you're creating your hair clusters is, and this applies mostly to hairstyles for the top of the head, but really anywhere that's symmetrical, you want to make sure that when you select your polys, you do select the same polys on each side of the character. And you might not think it's a big deal, but later on, if you want to use some of the symmetrical tools or the symmetry sculpting with hair, it does help the accuracy if you actually have, symmetrical polygons selected on each side. So just a little tip there when you're creating your hair clusters. So yeah, I've got my polygons selected, and the next thing I want to do is actually extract those polygons. So I'm going to do extract polygons and keep the underlying surface, because we don't want to delete the top of the head, of course. And let's go to the scene root here. So there's a few reasons for doing this. First of all, it's a bit simpler because now we can simply hide our underlying mesh and work with the actual hair object. And the other reason is for performance reasons. It's a good idea to abstract the actual hair emitter from your mesh. So if you've got a character with a lot of shape animation or a lot of deformations and a lot of stuff that has to get evaluated, when the hair is building the render hairs, it actually has to pull from the mesh to get the updated position and then generate the render hairs off that. So by creating an intermediate layer, you can kind of simplify the evaluations needed for the hair. So it gives you a little bit of a performance increase. Because we extracted the polygons, there's a modeling relation with the extracted polygons and the source mesh. So you don't have to worry about the hair object not sticking to the character or whatnot. As long as you don't freeze the object, you're always going to have that modeling relation on. Something you can do if it's like the scalp is you can freeze it and just re-envelope the scalp object to the head bone. Because, obviously the scalp doesn't change shape, so you're not too worried about getting the deformations. You just want the SRTs on the actual scalp object. So if you can use a system of constraints and you freeze the modeling relation, you'll actually get a little bit more of a performance improvement because it's not having to reevaluate the mesh underneath at all. And it's a little bit more of an optimal setup. The other nice thing about this is the extract tool does take into account the UV info. You can see the texture has been propagated to my extracted object, and that's really useful because a lot of times what you want to do with hair is get some UV coordinates off the source mesh to apply to the hair. And because we propagate the UVs over, there's no extra work needed here. We can just use the newly extracted polygons for transferring the UV map over, and we're good to go. So that's something new with 4.0 is the preserving of the UV info and the clusters. So it's pretty useful in this case. Okay, so we've got that there. The next thing I want to do is actually we're going to reduce the number of polygons on the hair object. So I'm going to take that and go polymesh, polyreduction. There we go. And there's one of the big reasons for doing this is because when you're working on production level characters, if we take this mesh for example, it's not really all that high res, but it's fairly typical of what you would see for a film character or maybe even a little lighter. It's about 2,000 or 3,000 polys. And that's fine because you want all that detail for rendering, but it is a bit of a problem when you're working with hair, because when we do hair from surface, we generate one hair guide per vertex. With complex, dense meshes, we'll often end up with tons of hair guides, and sculpting and managing that becomes a real nightmare because there's just too much detail there. So what we want to be able to do is we've extracted that object. We can then do the poly reduction on it. So I'm going to set the ratio. 50% sounds pretty good. So we've gone to about half there. I can just show you the difference as we go up and down. There's the full mesh, and then we go to about half that. I'm going to reset that to 50 because that actually looked pretty good to me. And I did the preserve quad lines there. Something you want to do, I made sure the mesh was symmetrical, and most characters will be. If you're seeing some problems where the actual poly reduction isn't symmetrical, what you can do is quickly apply Symmetry Map to it. And then from there, we can go to our, let's select our object, go to our poly reduction op, and then we can actually connect the symmetry map up here. So it just helps a little bit in maintaining the symmetry through the poly reduction. And so yeah, that's essentially the first step for creating our source emitter for the hair. And we'll go on to actually applying the hair next.